Well, today we're going to finish up our exploration of the American Civil War, but we're not going to examine the war itself, rather how Americans remember it. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, new black citizens began reaching eagerly for the freedom and equality promised by emancipation. Meanwhile, white Americans strive to reunite by downplaying sectional divides, celebrating shared white sacrifice on the battlefield, and denying the presence of African Americans in the war and in society. By the 50th anniversary of the war's end in 1915, American memory of the conflict had diverged onto two separate paths, black and white. The United States would heal without justice, and our national reunion would create a painful legacy that still haunts us today. Our speaker, David W. Blight, is class of 1954 professor of American history at Yale University. He is director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. He is currently writing a new full biography of Frederick Douglass that will be published by Simon & Schuster perhaps next year. He's nodding. His newest book, American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, received the 2012 Anisfield Wolf Award for Best Book in Nonfiction on Racism and Human Diversity. Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, received 8 book awards, including the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, and has become a standard text in college and graduate school history courses. Dr. Blight served on the advisory team for the 9/11 Memorial and Museum and has been a contributor to many documentary films, including the PBS series Africans in America, the Reconstruction Era, and the recent American Experience, Death in the Civil War. He is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Please welcome him to Minnesota.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Thank you. We on? Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday morning. You've heard this before, but I hope you have some idea how heartening it is as a historian to see this many people come out to hear about history on a Saturday morning. I'm serious. It's not this way everywhere. Only in Minnesota, maybe? Or Virginia? For different reasons? First of all, what a great idea, this assignment to kids to write back to Lincoln. I mean, it just occurred to me, have you ever stopped and just asked yourself, you ever gone, you don't get up every morning and go read the Gettysburg Address, I realize, but have you ever gone back to it and just asked what his argument was? I mean, we know words from the Gettysburg Address. We can recite most of it, perhaps, or not. Of the people, by the people, for the people. Shall not perish from the earth. Last measure of devotion. 7 years ago. All these phrases. About every other word in the Gettysburg Address has been used in a book title somewhere. But what was his argument? That's what kids, I hope, will be engaging. Dear Mr. President, I mean, if I was to write that letter, maybe I should. I'll fake it and tell him I'm 16. And then... What was his argument? Lincoln standing there in that now beginnings of a makeshift cemetery, soon to be the great national cemetery. Half those graves weren't even completed yet. There's still open graves with, you can see, they say you could still see the coffins. They just hadn't finished the thing. And what does Lincoln really argue in that speech? I mean, I have an answer. It's my answer. I don't know what all the students will say. Lincoln is trying to say to history in that speech, he's trying to say to Americans and to history, the first American republic has died. That republic, born 7 years ago, is being buried. It's being destroyed. We have destroyed that. That's what civil wars do. And a second one has to be created. Central metaphor of the Gettysburg Address is what? It's rebirth. His use of that word rebirth in the middle of the text. A rebirth. It's a difficult argument. We love the ending of the people, by the people, for the people. We love the patriotism of that speech, and we should. But its argument is tough. We've just destroyed ourselves. We have to recreate ourselves, and we have to redefine ourselves. Anyway, so if there are any 16-year-olds or 12-year-olds about to write this piece, just footnote me. No, don't footnote me. I don't want to be responsible for you winning or losing the great prize, whatever the prize is. Robert Penn Warren, in his wonderful, wonderful little book called Legacy of the Civil War, published in 1961 at the Centennial of the Civil War, said, "The Civil War is our oracle, darkly unriddled and portentous of national as well as personal fate." Now, there's a mouthful. The Civil War is our oracle, darkly unriddled and portentous national personal fate. Now, you could get up an argument around this country as to, which is the greatest pivot of our history, the turning point of our history. You can do the progressive movement next. That's a great idea. Tremendous historians out there. Wow, there's some turning points in the progressive era. But if the Civil War is certainly a candidate for that oracle in our past, think of the word oracle now, not as a tech company or whatever it is today, but as in its Greek roots, the place one goes to ask the big questions about who am I? What matters? Questions of existence. If the Civil War is in some way our oracle, as a nation, as a people, where is it? You're all here on a Saturday morning for a lecture about the memory of the American Civil War. Where's your Civil War oracle? Is it on Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg, at the First Minnesota Monument, down there just south of the high water mark? I've been there many times. I'm going there next week. Maybe some of you are going. There's a big conference next week at Gettysburg, Thursday, I think it starts Thursday, called The Future of Civil War History. Now, there's a pretentious title. History, yes, Vera, history has a future. And of course, I'm moderating a panel on Civil War memory. It's going to be wonderful because it's about 5 or 6 scholars, mostly younger people, who have all been writing kind of critiques of my book, Race and Reunion. And I get to moderate their discussion. I might just make sure where the door is, But anyway, where is your oracle? For some, it might be Monument Avenue in Richmond. That long, beautiful street that Richmond, Virginia built as a way of creating its first upscale suburb in the 1890s, unveiling the great equestrian of Robert E. Lee in 1890, and completing the 5 major Confederate memorials on that street over a course of about 1.5 miles in 1910. Douglas Southall Freeman, the great Lee scholar who wrote multi-volume biography of Lee and multi-volume study called Lee's Lieutenants, and used to be the editor of the Richmond Enquirer, used to live right off Monument Avenue, and we're told every day he would walk to work in the 1930s and 40s, and he'd salute that statue of Lee. I think we know where Freeman's oracle was. Or is it Stone Mountain in Georgia? That colossal, unfinished Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy. It's kind of good that it's unfinished. Where is it? Is it the Shaw Memorial in Boston? Augustus St. Gaudens's masterpiece of public art, the great bas-relief of Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th Massachusetts. If you haven't been to Boston to see it, it is the masterpiece of Civil War public art. It's a masterpiece of sculpture. 22 individual black men's faces and profiles captured in bronze. The first genuine humanizing of black people in a public monument, and a monument that really tells a story. That's one of my favorite oracles of the Civil War, but it could be many other places. Maybe your oracle is in a text. Maybe it's in a verse of a Walt Whitman poem, The Wound Dresser, or Lilacs, Last in the Dooryard Bloom, the great Lincoln Death poem. I mean, I don't know. Maybe your oracle is in your favorite Civil War book. Maybe it's a passage in a Jim McPherson book. Maybe it's a passage in a Bruce Catton book. I'll mention Catton more later. Catton's the first historian I ever read, at least the first one I ever remember reading as an early teenager, and it's all his fault. Is it Harper's Ferry? I don't know. Where's your oracle? Or is it just in the imagination that this event keeps feeding somehow for us? Before I dive right into Civil War memory with you and give us some categories and bring it right up to the centennial in the 1960s and now to the present with some reflections on, just suggestions and reflections that I hope you'll add to, about why we still feel this hold from this event or this traction to this event. Think with me for a moment just about how far back should we go into the past to understand anything? How far back? Last week? Last year? No. This began 10 years ago. No. It's really about 50 years now. No. You got to go back further. Where do you go? Marc Bloch, the great French historian who was killed in the Holocaust, wrote a beautiful essay once called The Idol of Origins. It's a wonderful little piece about how we historians are always looking for the origins of something. Every time we think we find that origin, oh, it's not quite there yet, not quite there yet. No, there's another origin, and then there's another tentacle here, another root there. We just keep going and going and going. We realize all things are pretty old. Nothing quite new under the sun. This is all an argument for why we have historians, of course. It's very self-serving. But as I was mentioned, as Danielle mentioned in the intro, I've been serving for years, several years, as an advisor for the 9/11 Memorial in New York. Just because I write about memory. They brought together about 10 or 12 writers, scholars, museum curators, people who write about memory, to be what they call their kitchen cabinet, which means they bring us in 2 or 3 times a year. We have these seminars on how they're going to interpret 9/11. The memorial is open, as you know, and some of you perhaps have visited New York and been to the memorial. Remarkable memorial. The museum will be beneath it, underground, 7 stories deep, a huge, thousands of square feet museum. It got decisively delayed last year by Hurricane Sandy because it flooded. The Hudson River moved in. But they've now cleaned it all out, and the museum now is on course to open anyway in about a year. But anyway, I was on an online forum last summer. I think it was last summer. New York Times did this online discussion. It actually wasn't a real live time discussion. It was created over a period of a few weeks. It was about 5 of us on it. 2 of us were sort of card-carrying historians. The other 2 were policy journalist types, writers who've written about 9/11 and war and policy. The 5th was a relative of one of the deceased from the 2 towers, a victim of 9/11, who has become very active in memorialization. Anyway, we were constantly prodded by an editor at the Times to have this discussion about how 9/11 ought be remembered 10 years out. I mean, the first answer usually from historians on that one is, I don't know, call me back in 20, 30 years maybe. It's too early. But that's not an answer yet. So we kept discussing, and we would write back, and they wanted us to have more of a debate. We were agreeing too much at the beginning. So finally they asked, all right, where do you start the story of 9/11? And people weighed in with this date and that date. Well, the 93 bombings of the World Trade Center. Remember? The first bombings of the World Trade Center. Yeah, but that's not very far back. And there was a growing consensus, especially among the policy guys, that now you really need to go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And there's a lot of logic to that, and that's actually where the museum is beginning the story. They got to start somewhere, and they only have so much space. Because that's how Al-Qaeda came to Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. And then we kept pushing back, no, wait a minute. You got to go back further in the Cold War and so on. You got to go back further in the history of radical Islam and so on and so on and so on. And I got just kind of annoyed at one point with all this kind of presentist thinking. And I said, how about to the Trojan War? And I was serious. I said, we want to really understand why human beings slaughter each other? The slaughter for political and ideological reasons of civilian peoples? This is not new. This is really old in human history. It's happened so many times we can't count it. How about the Trojan War? How about we ask everybody to read Euripides? I wasn't going to get anywhere with this, I understand. How about we ask people to read Euripides? How about we ask people to listen to Hecuba standing in the ruins of Troy, screaming at the top of her lungs at the death of her children, the death of her city, the death of her civilization as she's being marched on a slave ship? Everybody said, that's not going to work. I said, okay. But James Baldwin once suggested we go even further than that. Great African-American writer James Baldwin, who's one of the 4 chapters in this most recent book of mine called American Oracle. Baldwin, who became the primarily written voice of the civil rights era, and oratorical voice. King was the oratorical voice. Baldwin was the written voice of the civil rights era, especially in his nonfiction essays. But he has a passage in his novel called Another Country, published in the late 1950s. The protagonist in that book is named David. And Another Country is about all kinds of human problems and impulses and aspirations and tragedies. But at one point he has David musing about the Garden of Eden. And David says, quote, "Perhaps life offers only the choice of remembering the garden or forgetting it. Either or. It takes strength to remember. It takes another kind of strength to forget. It takes a hero to do both. People who remember court madness through the pain of the perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, and the world is mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. Heroes are rare." Is the world divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget? Now that sounds pretty cynical, doesn't it? Who wants to live in that world? But maybe we do. That's Baldwin's way, and he says it so many different ways, so many different places. It's Baldwin's way of saying most of what happens in history comes from our very nature. I thought I could employ the Garden of Eden with this audience, and at least you'd heard of it. I'm not sure students today, but they probably heard of it, but it's in a lyric of a rap song or something. How far back should we go? Well, let's come back to Civil War memory. for the rest. I won't go to the Garden of Eden or the Trojan War anymore, I promise. I want you to go with me to two places. And by the way, this idea of the future of Civil War history, every time you think something is waning about our past, we don't care about it anymore, beware. I will never forget the morning after Barack Obama's first election. It would have been the New York Times, November 5, 2008, editorial in the New York Times by Thomas Friedman, great columnist, who must have just that night, in the middle of the night, crafting that editorial, just been feeling it, because the topic sentence of his editorial the next morning read, last night, 10 p.m., November 4, 2008, United States of America, Grant Park, Chicago, Illinois, the American Civil War ended. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, Tom. How dumb. But I probably also had a flat, I was probably bleary-eyed at that point, having been on the winning side, and I probably also had a few seconds of thinking, oh God, what if he's right? That's bad for business. Anyway. But as we learned, it wasn't quite over, was it? There was an opposition effort out there against Mr. Obama and a lot of things, and we have been embroiled in, we're told, the most polarized political culture we've had in generations. We got a lot of little civil wars still going on, and some of them are deeply related to the first one, and that's where I'll take us in a few minutes. But I want to take you to two places in this story, one at the beginning of the 50th anniversary, and one in the midst of the 100th anniversary, as a way of then helping us think about, so where are we at 150? And why hasn't this bloody, horrible event just gone away? Why can't we get rid of our Civil War? Why won't that Confederacy go away? Why does it endure? It only lasted 4 years. I mean, what's up with that? The first place I want you to go with me, you won't recognize this one as easily as the second. Everyone in the room knows about my second example. To that in a moment. The first, though, is a great essay, delivered as a public address first by the great William James, the great American philosopher, the philosopher of pragmatism, the author of the Principles of Psychology, the author of so many things, especially those great essays on pragmatism in the 1890s. I always say to my students, unless you've read William James's essays on pragmatism, you shouldn't have U.S. citizenship. I have a short list. Don't you have your own short list of writers that, if you haven't read these people, they should deny you citizenship? Anyway. It's the essay he called The Moral Equivalent of War. Now, James, by 1910, when he published this is the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. And boy, was he thinking about that. James, by then, as you may know, had become pretty much nearly a pacifist, probably whatever a complete pacifist is, I'm not clear. He had joined the Anti-Imperialism League. He'd become, virulently anti-war before World War I. And he won't live long enough to know what happened in the Great War. But in the first paragraph of that famous essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, James says this, and he's still aiming right at us. Listen to his words. He says, I'm quoting him, there is something highly paradoxical in the modern man's relation to war. Ask all our millions, north and south, whether they would vote now, were such a thing possible, you're voting here, to have our war for the Union, this is the Civil War he's talking about, our war for the Union expunged from history. and the record of a peaceful transition to the present time substituted for that of its marches and battles. And probably hardly a handful of eccentrics would ever say yes. Those ancestors, those efforts, those memories and legends are the most ideal part of what we now own together, a sacred spiritual possession worth more than all the blood poured out. Yet, ask those same people whether they would be willing in cold blood to start another civil war now to gain a similar possession, and not one man or woman would vote for that proposition. What's James saying? It's a hard statement, isn't it? He's saying, oh, how we love to love our Civil War, 50 years out from it. What a sacred possession its events have given us. What a glorious story. We own it. We would never want to be without it. Oh, have another one? Are you kidding? Reminds me of the time Drew Faust, a historian you surely know. If you haven't read her Republic of Suffering, the book on death and death culture in the Civil War, you should. We have a every other year conference on the Civil War period at the Huntington Library in California. I say we, it's a group of historians, and some of us just scheme to get back each time we have it, because it's at the Huntington in Pasadena, and we invite a few young scholars along to initiate them. But we were doing the topic about 7 or 8 years ago on Civil War memory. And Drew Faust was the first speaker of the conference, and she first gave the paper she then published, which became part of her introduction to Republic of Suffering, and it was called Why We Love the Civil War. It was a fascinating little tour de force about what attracts us to this event, as professional historians, what attracts us to this event, and then what attracts our public culture to this event. And it was wonderfully done and poignant. And she was sort of poking the thumb in a few eyes of the audience. You know, Jim McPherson was there. Everybody was there. Sort of everybody was there. And then after that, all of us who got up to give our papers over the next 2.5 days had to sort of fess up at the beginning of well, I guess I love the Civil War because, or I don't know, maybe it's because, and all these people were kvetching at the platform trying to explain, well, I don't love it, it's fascinating. She made everybody uncomfortable, which is what the best historians should do. Please, you can still come up to me afterward at lunch or whatever and tell me why you love the Civil War, because I grew up with the same craziness, and it's Bruce Catton's fault. Second place I want you to go with me, 53 years later. You've all been there in your historical memories if you weren't there physically. August 28th, 1963, hot August day, Washington, D.C., the mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It's the day, of course, of the March on Washington. It's the day Martin Luther King was the 11th or 12th speaker throughout that long afternoon. It's the day he gave the famous I Have a Dream speech. Everybody knows, every kid in America now grows up with some moment when they've been introduced to the I Have a Dream speech. It's become iconic. It's used in commercials. You can hear it on the radio. But what part of that speech do we usually hear? It's almost always the ending, isn't it? For good rhetorical reasons. But the dream metaphor in the dream speech only comes in the 14th minute of a 17-minute speech. It's the last 3 minutes of that speech. And it appears to be extemporaneous by King, and it was. It's actually not in his text that day, although he'd practiced that metaphor before. But the first 14 minutes of the speech are not about the dream metaphor at all. The I Have a Dream speech begins with this paragraph. And just ask yourself, what is King doing at that moment? It's 1963, 50 years ago. We're going to have the 50th anniversary of that this summer, too. 50 years ago, said King, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And there he is, right behind him, the big fellow. This momentous decree came as a beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, and this becomes the first refrain of the speech, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on an island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. That's how the dream speech begins. What's King doing? He's saying, folks, we're gathered here on the 100th anniversary of emancipation, and black folk aren't free. What's up with that? And for the next 12 minutes, he made the country hurt. Pull it up on YouTube. It takes 2 clicks or 3. You can just listen to the dream speech with the crowd noise with it. Listen to the whole thing. The I Have a Dream speech is the greatest Civil War centennial speech delivered during that commemoration of the early 1960s. It's never going to get remembered. I mean, I'm on a crusade to change the title of the I Have a Dream speech. Yeah, right. I'm not going to win that one either. I'm not going to get people to go back to the Trojan War, and I'm not going to get people to change the title of this speech. Why would we? And it was then in the next paragraph that King moved into other metaphors of what he called the promissory note, which by which at that point he meant the Declaration of Independence. He said that promissory note has come back labeled insufficient funds in the Bank of American Justice. And then he just starts raining metaphors down on his audience about historical memory and who's controlled that memory, and how the society that most black people live in the South has been controlled by a memory of the Civil War and emancipation and Reconstruction that riveted black folk in Jim Crow. We love the ending of that speech because it's what works for young people. We want them to dream of universal equality and a brotherhood and a sisterhood. But we shouldn't let them get to that point without knowing what King took the audience through before that. And by the way, there's a fascinating backstory to that speech. I'll give it to you briefly, if I can. In this book, American Oracle, I have a little section on this, but then I had a senior thesis student at Yale, typical of some of them. They're not all quite like this, but I had an amazing senior essay student last year who read these couple paragraphs in my book and was in a seminar with me, and we got to talking, and she took this and went and did deeper research on it. And I owe much of what I know about this now to her. Her name is Allison Sharfstein. I always give her a complete public footnote when I mention this. And in fact, no, she's not from Minnesota. But, the backstory is basically this. 48 hours after John Kennedy was inaugurated president, January 1961, a lot of us in this room can remember this, Martin Luther King and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization of ministers around King that had been leading a major phase of the civil rights movement, telegraphed the White House. That early, that quickly, they telegraphed the White House And they asked President Kennedy to begin to consider drafting and issuing a second Emancipation Proclamation. And that second Emancipation Proclamation, they argued, should be an executive order like the first one, modeled on Lincoln, in national crisis. Yes, it wasn't civil war yet, but they actually are likening the crises over the civil rights movement to the Civil War, and they say the president should issue an executive order outlawing racial segregation in all aspects of American life now. Executive order. They start arguing for that literally 2 days after Kennedy was inaugurated. Now, the reason they did, well, a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was that during the Kennedy-Nixon debates, and if I was so young, I mean, I can remember the Kennedy-Nixon debates, although I wonder sometimes, I remember mostly what I've seen on the newsreel since, Nixon sweated and Kennedy didn't and all that nonsense. But in the midst of those debates and in the campaign of the fall of 1960, John Kennedy made a big deal out of how slow the Eisenhower administration had been on civil rights. And of course, Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. And he kept making the case that why didn't President Eisenhower issue more executive orders? Why didn't President Eisenhower use the stroke of the pen about racial discrimination? It was a good political ploy. It was Kennedy working the civil rights vote, at least somewhat. Stroke of the president's pen. Now, whenever you hear that language, you know a president's thinking executive order. And you heard it from President Obama back just before he issued a few executive orders about immigration. Anyway, well, one thing led to another. They kept reminding the president, SCLC and King kept reminding the president of his language of stroke of the pen during the campaign. Sir, what about that stroke of the pen? Now, inside the White House, there was part of Kennedy's leadership or his aides were very much sympathetic with King and SCLC, namely Harris Wofford. You may remember Harris Wofford, former senator from Pennsylvania. He had been a civil rights attorney most of his life. He had worked in the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. He was from Mississippi. He was a southern-born white guy who had become a racial liberal. He had good southern credentials, to say the least. Harris Wofford was kind of the civil rights attorney within the White House. He was kind of a, prod on Kennedy over the next 2 years to think about doing this. And he issued memo after memo. The memos are there in the Kennedy Library, arguing that there were precedents for this. FDR had issued the famous executive order for the Federal Employment Protection Commission, FEPC, in 1941, also under the threat of a great march on Washington, led by A. Philip Randolph. Or, even better, Harry Truman's executive order to desegregate the entire American Armed Forces in 1948. We were sort of we were in the Cold War, about to go to war in Korea. We just got out of the big war. Was it wartime? You could say yes or you could say no, but Truman desegregated the military by executive order. And there are a number of other precedents. This debate goes on and on. Kennedy and King actually first met in June 1961. I'm sorry. They first met in June 1961, and then, June 1960, excuse me. Got to get your chronology right. And it was around the issue of King's imprisonment in jail in Birmingham and the fact that Kennedy had called Coretta King and so on and so forth, something Nixon always remembered that he should have done and so forth. Eventually, in the fall of 1961, King first visited the White House. He got a personal tour of the White House with President Kennedy, and they toured the Lincoln Room. And as you may know, in the Lincoln Room of the White House is one of the original copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. And King and John Kennedy stood in front of the Emancipation Proclamation, and King said to Kennedy, Mr. President, you should issue the second one. And King tells us that Kennedy said, well, that's an interesting idea. Why don't you draft something? And so King went back to his aides, particularly his lawyers, in the fall of '61, and that's exactly what they did. And by early '62, they had their draft. I'm leaving out a lot of wonderful details, but in May of 1962, May 17th to be exact, I published an editorial in the New York Times last May 17th on the 50th anniversary of this event. King held a major public news conference in Washington, D.C., appealing to memory. It was a Sheraton Hotel in Washington, where he issued, I have a copy, I carry it around, a 65-page manifesto, 65-page document, which was an appeal to the President of the United States to issue the Second Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what the document is, in essence, it's an amazing document. It was written by his lawyers, particularly a lawyer named Clarence Jones, African-American attorney who's still alive. He lives in Palo Alto, California. I got him on the phone last year. Anyway, the document begins with a 4-page preamble. And by the way, the sole author of the document is listed as Martin Luther King. Lawyers wrote the last 60 pages, trust me, if you read it, you know. But the first 4 pages are this flowing, sort of beautiful appeal to all kinds of egalitarian texts and traditions in American history. He cites Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land." He cites songs. He quotes from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. He, of course, quotes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He quotes from Bruce Catton's book of that very year, Terrible Swift Sword, which is about the Antietam campaign. I'm going to quote from that in a minute. He quotes from Frederick Douglass's third autobiography, Life and Times, and on it goes. And of course, he also quotes JFK's book, Strategy for Peace, this Cold War manifesto about America as the beacon of liberty and equality for the world. And then comes 60 pages of legal precedents, piled one on another, court cases of all kinds, legal precedents of legislation of all sorts, from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation right on up into the 1950s, citing every kind of evidence they can pile on about why a president ought have the power now through executive order to desegregate the United States. And then King and his aides delivered the copy to the White House. Very public. It's a forgotten part of the civil rights era. And Kennedy White House, now remember when this is. This is '62 now. There's a whole lot going on in the civil rights movement in the South, and it's been very difficult for the Kennedy administration to own up to it, to shoulder up to it. How much do they really support the on-the-ground movement? Because the Southern Democrats still have control of this party called the Democrats, lest we forget. It's a very different party system today. Try to educate students on why Democrats are now Republicans and Republicans are now Democrats, and they just look at you. Except the ones who actually read the books you assign in the class. But the Southern Democrats still control most of the Senate and congressional committees and so forth and so on. Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy is Attorney General, of course, is trying to walk a tightrope on this. Arthur Schlesinger, the White House historian, a lot of memos. Schlesinger really is sympathetic to King and SCLC on this. And he does prod the president to think about this. Maybe there were sort of small measures, Schlesinger says to Kennedy in '62 in White House memos. You know, maybe you could do an executive order on this or on that. And eventually, Kennedy did an executive order in November '62 on housing, federal housing. Anyway, there's a divided debate even within Kennedy's team as to how to respond to this. And of course, it's the summer and fall of '62. Now, to get us out of this story, the problem was they had a big anniversary coming up. And there was this huge Civil War Centennial Commission. We don't have a commission today. Some of us may be talking about this over lunch, like how is our Sesquicentennial different from the Centennial? Well, one huge difference is there is no national commission today. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The Great Recession is one of them. The divisions of our political culture is another. Having a black president is another. The Obama White House doesn't want much to do with this anyway. But they got a big anniversary coming up in September 1962, and it is, of course, the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It's the 100th anniversary, September 22nd. What will the government do? And this commission's been going now since the late 1950s. It's been alternately an embarrassing debacle and then sometimes just a debacle. They had a horrible beginning at Fort Sumter on the anniversary, with this, where they had to segregate delegates who were black because Charleston wouldn't allow one black woman from the New Jersey Commission to stay in the Francis Marion Hotel. Kennedy had to personally step in and fire the leadership, the original leadership of the U.S. Centennial Civil War Commission, which was led, by the way, by Ulysses S. Grant III. Do you know that? That's Grant's great-great-grandson, who was a flaming white supremacist. No kidding. That's absolutely true. And they wanted, the leadership of the Civil War Centennial Commission up to that point wanted nothing whatsoever to do with even touching the question of the memory and commemoration of emancipation or civil rights. They didn't want the word civil rights mentioned in the same sentence with civil war. Now today you might think, well, how could they? You got this huge civil rights revolution going on out there in America. The whole world is now beginning to watch on television by 1962. And you can't even mention it when you're commemorating the American Civil War, which ended in emancipation and set up all the historical circumstances that led to this. No, the answer was you can't. Except Kennedy fired the leadership. He put in charge Allen Nevins, great historian, and a young 32-year-old Virginia-born Southern historian named Bud Robertson. And Bud is still around, still out there, still lecturing, and he'll come and tell you his thoughts on the Civil War Centennial. Just ask him. So they tried to plan the commemoration of September 22nd. Of course, it had to be at the Lincoln Memorial, or else you're going to do it. And it was initially announced that President Kennedy would be the major speaker. And King and SCLC and the civil rights leadership thought, whoa, maybe he's going to do it or do something. If Kennedy comes to the Lincoln Memorial on the anniversary of the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, I mean, he's got to say something. About 2 weeks before the event, it was announced that the president had a scheduling conflict, and he could not be there. The truth is, his plan that day was to be at the America's Cup yacht race off Cape Cod, which is where he was. And he pulled out. Now, that's a political decision within the White House. And Kennedy did tape an address. It's a brief 10-minute speech. They taped it and they played it on an audio tape. No big screens in those days. And it was a pretty vague statement about the importance of equality in America and so forth. But for the keynote speaker, they decided it would be Adlai Stevenson. Now, Adlai Stevenson, the standard bearer of the Democratic Party in the 1950s, currently the ambassador to the United Nations, and senator from Illinois, and a Lincoln expert, so perfect, right? Adlai. The trouble was they had never thought to ask any African American to have any prominent role on the platform. Now, today that seems so weird to us. What were they thinking? They got Archibald MacLeish to do a new poem for the occasion. They did ask a young African American classical composer named Ulysses Kay to produce an original piece, and he did, and it was performed by a small orchestra. And at the last minute, they got Thurgood Marshall, who was on the Federal Court of Appeals, soon to be appointed to the Supreme Court, but not yet. Thurgood Marshall agreed to be there and say a few words. And of course, at the last minute, they asked Mahalia Jackson to come and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I mean, how could you do it without that? And they had the event. About 3,000 people showed up. It wasn't that big a deal. Adlai gave a remarkable speech all about the Cold War. Now, that's not that surprising if you think of this is September of '62. We now know that the missiles in Cuba, or the possibility of warheads on missiles in Cuba, they're aware of this in the White House by the beginning of September. So, it's not like the Kennedy administration doesn't have something else on its mind. But Adlai Stevenson's speech is fascinating. It's all about America as a beacon to the world of hope and liberty and equality and freedom. It mentions emancipation as an event that we did and completed and so forth. It's not really about the memory of Jim Crow at all. That's as close as officially our government could come to embracing the two stories together of the Civil War and civil rights. In my book, I argue at great length, not great length, some length, that the Civil War and civil rights at the Centennial were like planets orbiting separate suns. They just never found their way into the same orbit. Let's come to the present. Here we are. We're having a sesquicentennial. I'm going to run through a little list with you. It's just my list. You can write these down or throw them away, but please add to it. These are just reflections of mine on why I think this event of the Civil War, at least in Minneapolis on a Saturday morning, still has a hold on us. Oh, God, Jesus, I'm sorry. At least in St. Paul on a Saturday morning. Why didn't you warn me again? I was here 5 years ago, and I think I made the same mistake. Ouch. Yeah, that's like saying to a Michigan State graduate, it's nice that you went to Michigan. My brother went to Michigan, I went to Michigan State. Anyway. Okay, number one. Why does the Civil War have a hold on us in St. Paul? First is, I think, demographics. I mean, if you think about it. When I first heard this statistic, I found it hard to believe, but it's true. 1 of every 3 American citizens, so we're over 300 million people now, about 100 million of us can trace our ancestry directly to somebody in the Civil War, if we choose to. Not everybody perhaps even knows that, but I suspect millions and millions do, black and white. 1 of every 3 of us in this country had somebody in that event, in one way or another. Our knowledge of exactly who they were and what they did may be very limited, hardly existent, or detailed, but it's still a family story. Nothing attracts us to the past sometimes more than our family connection. Great-great-granddad. And man, I didn't understand that completely until I was doing Bruce Catton research. All right, how many in this audience grew up reading Bruce Catton? Yes. Bruce, the great narrative historian of the 50s and 60s, had more readers than any author on this subject ever, including Shelby Foote and my good friend Jim McPherson, although Jim may be catching up. No one ever written anything about Bruce Catton in his 15 books and his massive audience and his great American heritage pictorial history of the Civil War and the kind of impact that his books had. No one ever written about him. He left huge stashes of personal papers. For reasons I could explain if somebody wants to know, one stash of those is at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places. The other stash, even larger, is in Laramie, Wyoming, because that's where the American Heritage Archive is. So if you want to, one of the reasons no one's written on Bruce Catton is you got to go spend a lot of time in Laramie. You know, a week and a half at the Laramie Holiday Inn is not everybody's cup of tea. But anyway, in Bruce Catton's papers, there are thousands of fan letters from the 50s and 60s. I mean, his books would sell hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies. Bestseller list, Book of the Month Club, on and on. And often in these letters, especially in the 50s, after Stillness and Appomattox was published in '54 in particular, he gets letters, dozens of letters where people will say, "Oh, Mr. Catton, I love your book, can't wait for the next one. I try to read them slowly, I can't wait. When is the next one coming out?" And there are reasons Catton could produce a book every other year, and I could talk on that later too. But often in these letters, though, someone will say, by the way, on page 87 of Stillness, when you quote that diary of that soldier in the 14th New York Volunteers, that's my grandfather. Or that's my great-grandfather. And in a couple instances, it's my father. And you start doing the math and you realize that, oh, that's still entirely possible in the 1950s. My favorite, though, is the letter, and I quote it in the book. Guy writes to him and says, "Mr. Catton, love your books, blah, blah, blah. I had 9 great-uncles in the Civil War. There was 4 on the Union side, 5 on the Confederate side, and then he says, but you only quote 2 of them. Didn't you know that there are these letters and there's this diary here and there's this, and Catton read an incredible amount of letters and diaries, but it's family. That's the first reason. Secondly, loss. Loss. We're drawn back to this event if we even got one eye open because we realize that it's the one time in American history when Americans experienced loss on a scale that we've never experienced since, and that most countries have never experienced, except, of course, in the Great War and in the Second World War in Europe and Asia. Loss compels us to ask, how could this happen? How could a republic tear itself to, with an incredible future and resources, especially as it kept going west, how could it tear itself to pieces in the middle of the 19th century the way it did? And engage in that kind of bloodletting for that long. Well, how could they do that? And now, of course, we have new evidence. It's barely a year out now. The article published by a young statistical economic historian named David Hacker, who has shown by a very sophisticated study of the census and a whole lot of other sources that our official count of the Civil War dead, you may know this, but if you didn't know this, write this one down. The official count of Civil War dead, if you look it up, is 620,000, both sides. Hacker's new research says that's at least 100,000 low, and it's more likely 750,000. That we have been off by 15 and 20%. And this does not count civilians and does not count freed people, former slaves who died in the process of making it to contraband camps, where we now have great research going on showing us that possibly 1 of every 4 slaves who escaped into Union lines or a contraband camp died in the process. Loss compels us to ask, why? And every time we experience loss again, like 9/11. Do you remember 9/11? In the immediate aftermath, we're all struggling for analogies. What is this like? And all over the press it would say Antietam, Shiloh, Gettysburg. It's the only place we can go for similar numbers. 3. Look, let's be honest. We love this. Love? Is that word again? We're attracted to this story because it is epic in the old-fashioned sense of that word. Don't apologize for it. There's an epic quality. If you like epic history, that is big beginnings, violent and conflicted middles, and some kind of tragic but redemptive endings with heroes and villains all along the way, the stuff of epic. You got one here, right? If a republic that votes for its governments, and a republic that is one of the few left, it's one of the few real republics on earth, tears itself to pieces in a civil war over the largest slave system on the planet, well, actually second to Russian serfdom, destroys itself and then has to reinvent itself out of that destruction, that's a hell of a story. We're attracted to it because it's a hell of a story. Maybe that's the only reason you need. And boy, did Bruce Catton know that. If you've read a Bruce Catton book, you know something about his qualities with narrative. He gained that in great part because he spent so many years as a journalist. He knew how to write a story. He knew a topic sentence when he met one. He also spent a lot of time in World War II as a press agent. He knew something about public relations. He was Henry Wallace's press secretary, FDR's vice president. And for a while he worked in the presidential speech writing and press office under FDR, etc. He quit his government job in 1948 and walked over to the Library of Congress and just started reading Civil War letters and diaries. And the first book came out in 1951 called Mr. Lincoln's Army. That good Yankee, born in a tiny little, or just near a tiny little town called Benzonia, Michigan, almost 300 miles northwest of Detroit, in the cut-over timber district of northern Michigan, as he put it. But Bruce Catton grew up as a boy at the turn of the century, born 1899. And he's a little boy in Benzonia in the aughts, and then he becomes a teenager in the teens. He will eventually drop out of Oberlin College and enlist in the U.S. Navy in World War I. But in his youth, he said, the only thing there was to do in Benzonia. And he wrote a beautiful memoir about this called Waiting for the Morning Train. You should read it. He said, oh, there's nothing else to do. If you couldn't get up a baseball game, the only thing there was to do in Benzonia was go down to the train station or to the town green and talk to the old Civil War veterans. And there was a couple dozen of them always around, at least for a while. A few of them had the empty sleeve. And he says, as a boy, I just would go and ask them something, and they'd just talk all day. He loved it. He loved their little parades to the monuments on Memorial Day. He loved it. That's where his fascination began. He became much more serious about what war actually is. But listen to this one paragraph. Great story, epic. Listen to this one paragraph by Bruce Catton. It's in Terrible Swift Sword, 1963. It's the book about 1862. It's the Antietam campaign as Lee's army is about to invade Maryland and into the north. And here's how Catton captures that moment. Quote, there was nobility in the idea that there ought to be a peace without victory. Yet in August of 1862, America's tragedy was that it was caught between the madness of going on with the war and the human impossibility of ever stopping it. Neither Mr. Lincoln or Mr. Davis was going to assume anything of the kind. Each man was fighting for a dreadful simplicity. Neither one could describe a solution acceptable to him without describing something wholly unacceptable to the other. Neither man could accept anything less than complete victory without admitting complete defeat. That's actually a genuine definition of tragedy, if you think about it. And then he concludes, both sides had heard the trumpet that could never call retreat. The peacemakers could not be heard until the terrible swift sword had been sheathed. But the scabbard had been thrown away, and now the Confederacy was carrying the war into the enemy's territory. Now, Bruce Catton's the only professional historian I know, who had the audacity to use the actual phrases of the Battle Hymn of the Republic in his own prose and get away with it. Four or five, whatever number we're on this list. You've heard this many times. I suspect there's an element of it in the exhibition here. I don't know yet. I haven't been up to see it. But you've heard it many times that somehow a modern America was born out of our Civil War. If you want to go back and find the beginnings of modern America, modernity, modern government, modern industrialization, a modern relationship of central authority to private enterprise, it's in the Civil War. Now, there's a lot to this argument. There's no question about it in some ways, especially on the issue of centralized authority or the growth of the federal government. When does our federal government tend to grow in our history? Well, when we have big wars. You got a war to win, you need a government. Sometimes I want to say, when all over our political culture, as everyone in this room knows, we hear all the time people denigrating government. It's too big, it's this, it's that, we don't need it for this, we don't need it for that. And sometimes I just want to grab one of those people by the lapels and say, would you have preferred to lose the Civil War? How about World War II? What side were you on in that one? You don't like private enterprise and government having a relationship? You could have lost World War II. I know, that's not fair. But big government was born in the Lincoln administration. Look what they did. The Homestead Act. Folks out in this region of the country know about the Homestead Act. Transcontinental railroads. Whoa. One of the most corrupt enterprises in all of American history in the relationship of private enterprise to the government. But they built the transcontinentals with our money. The income tax. The first American income tax was created in 1862. You'd love to have those rates. Oh, man, the highest rate for anyone making over, I think it was $10,000, it was a lot of money in 1862, was like 7 or 8%. Sign me up. The greenback dollar. The finance system, it financed the civil. They went to Wall Street and they got Jay Gould and they said, Mr. Gould, would you help us create something called government bonds and tell us how to do this? And it worked. Incredibly successful financing system that paid for the war. And one could go on and on. The Quartermaster Corps, the second largest employer in the United States in 1864, 3 years into the war, was the Quartermaster Corps. It had 100,000 employees working for the federal government. This was the huge agency invented in 1861 to produce the material of war all over the North from factories and shops. I like to tell my students at Yale the Civil War was won in the Connecticut River Valley because of all those guns made and all those gun manufacturers all up and down, a few of which are still there. And boy, they have a strong lobby in Connecticut. That's another story. But the only employer any larger than the Quartermaster Corps in 1864 was the Union Army. That's big government. And the biggest act of big government, you could argue ever, was the Emancipation Proclamation. That's an executive order that confiscated $3.5 billion worth of personal property. We will never have a confiscation. Historians should never predict, but I'll predict this one. We'll never have another confiscation of personal property by a presidential executive order on that scale again. Unless we have a civil war, I guess. I don't know. Let's not go there, though. Civil wars, the great lesson of civil wars is don't have them. They're not good. And then next, I think we're attracted to this event. See if this one fits. Try this jacket on if it fits. I think we're attracted to this event because we have, as Danielle was suggesting even in her introduction, and it's all over my book, Race and Reunion, we have managed to convert in our historical memory, in our broad culture, a story of unity out of such division. The images, you have some images in this wonderful handout they prepared for you. I don't need any slides because there's some great photos in this handout. These images of the blue and the gray shaking hands at blue-gray reunions, which became very, very popular events by the 1890s. It took a while to get blue-gray reunions to happen, but once they did, cities all over the country would compete for them because they were great money makers. By the time we got to that 50th anniversary, the theme of national reconciliation, of unifying the Union again, for good reasons. The Union had to get unified again. The problem was how it was unified. But we love the story of unity out of such division. There's something very moving about it. It had its cost, it had its consequences. And then next, we're drawn to this event, especially in our lifetimes. Especially in the last 30 to 40 years, especially because of the revolution we've had in the study of slavery and emancipation and its aftermath, especially because of the revolution in the study of African American history, which has occurred basically in my lifetime. we now see the Civil War as maybe Lincoln at least intended it in that rebirth metaphor, as our first great racial reckoning. The republic born in the late 18th century, so deeply committed and complicitous in its constitution to the existence of and perpetuity of slavery, racial slavery, it did get destroyed in this bloodletting. The Civil War is our, if we want to understand our racial problems, which never seem to die, never seem to go away, keep cropping up, keep surprising the next generation, time after time after time. They want to live in a post-racial society, they believe they live in a post-racial society, and then boom, they find they're still racist, and they wonder, how can that be? They got to go find their feet somewhere. They got to figure out where in the past to go to find, well, they don't have to. They need our help in finding their feet. The Civil War is our first great racial reckoning. And lastly, back to Lincoln's metaphor of rebirth. Why not? It's right there in the Gettysburg Address. He said it again, in effect, in the second inaugural. And we have enormous scholarship now that argues this. It was even a line in a George Bush speech. No, I mean that sincerely, that he gave at the NAACP. I think he understood, I don't know if he understood it, but he said it. The Civil War is the death of the first American republic and the birth of a second one. You're not living in the original American republic. Despite all you hear about originalism and the founders intended. If we were still living under the original Constitution, do you want to live under the original Constitution? It wasn't a piece of stone. It got revised. And it got revised. Oh, did it get revised in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? If the American Civil War is the death of the First Republic, the birth of that second one is there. It's fledgling. Two of those three amendments were essentially, well, all three really were essentially compromises, but it's born there in that rewriting of the Constitution. One of the greatest values of this recent Lincoln movie, I thought I'd bring it up before you do, is of course the lesson it gives the country and the world about that two-sentence amendment called the 13th Amendment. Most Americans, frankly, didn't know anything about the 13th Amendment. And now they do, I hope. Well, at least those who've seen the movie. But the 14th Amendment, you live in the land of the 14th Amendment. You live in the land of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. That's really our Constitution now. 2/3 of all litigation in a case law book in law schools is 14th Amendment litigation, based on Section 1, which begins with what? All persons born in the United States shall be citizens. All persons born. Birthright citizenship was first put into the Constitution because of the emancipation of 4 million slaves and the necessity of figuring out, well, who are these people now? What are we going to do with them? All persons born in the United States. And of course, that famous first paragraph, crafted by John Bingham of Ohio, ends with the Equal Protection Clause. Equal protection, you are guaranteed the equal protection of the law. Now, that's been used to support corporations, to support Citizens United, so many different ends of the political spectrum of our society. But that's where you live now. You live in the land of the 14th Amendment. We wouldn't have it without the emancipation of the slaves. Now, lastly, right now, I mean, if you're looking for Civil War legacies, right now, I mean, you don't need me to tell you this. All you need to do is read a newspaper. It's all around us. Most visibly, I suppose, right now, maybe less in our racial politics, although there's a lot of it there too, but especially in our roiling, constant debate right now about the nature of federalism. The proper relationship of the states to the federal government. We're living through an extended states' rights revival in the United States right now. We've been living through it for quite some time, well before the Obama presidency. We have a Supreme Court with a states' rights majority. They probably are about to strike down the 65 civil rights, voting rights bill. Probably. I don't know. I hope John Roberts is having some bad nights sleeping and maybe at least considering it. And if you know him, have a talk with him. But out in state legislatures, and there are lots of websites that chart this, by the way, there are hundreds and hundreds of bills. The action in America, there isn't much action in Congress, is there? The action in America is in state legislatures, especially those 35 or 36 controlled by the Republican Party, where there are hundreds of bills, not all of them have passed, trying to bring power away from the federal government back to the states, especially on issues like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Endangered Species Act, interstate commerce, immigration laws, and especially health care. My own favorites are those bills that some states have had. Kentucky had one. Apparently it hasn't passed yet, that would have made the entire state of Kentucky a sanctuary from the EPA. Federal EPA would have no authority within its state. That's nullification by any other word. Or another favorite of mine, and this one I just looked up, has not yet passed either, so we can maybe be glad of that. Montana had a bill that would have required the FBI to get the permission of a local sheriff to ever make an arrest within the state of Montana. Now, how much American history do you not have to know what's wrong with that? Or how much American history do you wish hadn't happened to know what's wrong with that? There are 1,000 examples. Go look at some Tea Party websites. Nothing against the Tea Party. Yes, I'm sorry. But there may be Tea Party members. That's great. Let's have a debate. But go look at some Tea Party websites. A lot of them invoke the Confederate Constitution, and what they invoke about the Confederate Constitution is its resistance to centralized authority. It's what they're about. There are other aspects of the Confederate Constitution they don't quote. Ignore. All right. I'll end and leave you now. But let me leave you with this. When Robert Penn Warren had to figure out a way to end that little book that I started with today, his 1961 little 100-page pamphlet called Legacy of the Civil War, when Warren was actually the great Robert Penn Warren, novelist, essayist, nonfiction writer, I think underappreciated. He's the subject of a long chapter in my most recent book. When he was looking for a way to end that meditation he wrote in 1961 on the meaning of the Civil War at that moment for the country. And by the way, he was asked to do that by Life magazine. They asked him to write a sort of long essay. Those were the days, remember, I don't know if you remember the old days when Life magazine would do these long essays, you know. There's still some remnant of that left in American journalism, but not as much. He's asked by the editor of Life to do this piece. Red, and that was his nickname. Write a meditation on the meaning and memory of the Civil War. As a Southerner who by then, of course, had come north and spent the last 40 years of his life at Yale, and spent most of his life trying to reject that segregationist, racist world he was raised in, and he too, oh, did he ever grow to love the Civil War. But in Robert Penn Warren's case, he did it at the feet of his grandfather, Gabriel Penn, who was a Confederate veteran. Little Red Warren, when he was growing up near Guthrie, Kentucky, in the first decade of the 20th century, was sent every summer out to stay with his granddad. He loved his grandfather. His grandfather was a great storyteller. He'd sit with a corncob pipe and a wicker chair, and he'd tell tales of being in Nathan Bedford Forrest Cavalry. Now, how cool was that for a kid? And they would draw diagrams of battles and campaigns in the dirt and the dust. And Gabriel Penn, his grandfather, would even read romantic poetry to him. He read Byron to him. Who reads Byron to their kids anymore? Who reads Byron? No, nobody. Little Red grew up and is steeped in it. He said when he was growing up, he said the Civil War, in his grandfather's version, became the emotional furniture in my soul. Whoa. Warren had done a lot to break out of that furniture. He's looking for a way to end that essay in 61, and he went to his favorite writer. We all do that, don't we? When in doubt, I have 3 or 4. When in doubt, I just quote them endlessly. He went to Herman Melville, the great tragedian. Warren was a total Melvillian. He thought Melville was the greatest American writer. And he quotes Melville from Melville's collection of poetry, the supplement that Melville published of his poems called Battle Pieces in 1866. And in that, Melville says at the very end of his introduction to that, he's writing this right after the war, 1 year after the war. And Melville says, quote, "Let us pray that the terrible historic tragedy of our time may not have been enacted without instructing our whole beloved country through pity and terror." Genuine tragedy, an utter bloodletting, a tearing up, but let us hope we've been instructed by it. That's the old Aristotelian Greek definition of tragedy. Tragedy is bleak, it's horrible, it's almost unsurvivable, but some do survive. Warren quotes that, and then he says, have we been instructed by this tragedy 100 years later? Have we been instructed by such pity and terror? This is Warren now asking it of his own time at 100 years. And he answers, quote, "Sadly, we must answer no. We have not yet achieved justice. We have not yet created a union which is in the deepest sense a true community." That's 1961, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. One of the best things we could keep asking ourselves today at 150 years after this event is, how have we been instructed? How are we instructing ourselves still about the legacies of that event? Thank you.